Thank you for coming back this afternoon. We have a wonderful speaker, Dr. Mary Tobin. She has helped literally thousands of people regain their health and vitality after prescription drugs and other conventional procedures. And much of the LiveAware conference is really looking at your health and trying to get less dependent on drugs and things and more dependent on your nutrition and your health. She's got an extensive knowledge of getting to the root problem, that really getting to the not just the symptoms and covering them up. And she is a holistic scientist. She has a degree in holistic science, oriental medicine, and homeopathic medicine. So she really has a broad spectrum of that holistic knowledge. So I'm excited to have her come and talk about food being your medicine and medicine being your food, and really how food can help us in our internal system of being healthy. So thank you, Mary, for coming.
Thank you. Well, before I start, I'm going to ask you a question. And you can show me by the raise of hand. Who here is absolutely positive that they do not have cancer? Everybody just kind of looks at me like, well, what a question to ask. Exactly. Well, okay, let me reword that. Who here has either had some experience with cancer or has a little bit of a concern that they might have cancer? That gets a little different response. Well, there's a good reason for that. Because 1 in 2 of us, so every other person in this room, will get a cancer diagnosis, which wouldn't be so scary, except for 1 in 3 of those that's diagnosed with cancer will die from cancer. So it's a big deal. And when we look at it, one of the things that we always want to do is get to the root of the problem. One of the things with cancer is we've literally spent billions of dollars researching cures for cancer. And in 1950, in 1950, it was second leading cause of death in the United States. Guess what it still is? Second leading cause of death in the United States. We're not making, we're not making a huge amount of progress on recovering from cancer and solving the problem. And part of the reason is that we've been coming at it as a genetic disease. Like every cancer is different. We're going to focus on breast cancer and prostate cancer and lung cancer. And each one has its individual types of cancer. But cancer itself, what they've been finding out really is more of a metabolic disease. It's a systemic disease. It's coming from what we're eating and from our environment. So that's our second leading cause of death. Now, who knows what our first leading cause of death is? Yep, exactly. Heart disease. That's our #1 killer. But oftentimes the first sign of the disease is death. It's not a great first sign. And oftentimes when people get a hint that there's something wrong, you've got high blood pressure, we don't panic. When somebody says, oh, you've got high blood pressure, we're going to put you on blood pressure medication, people don't come home, oh, honey, it's terrible. I just got a diagnosis of high blood pressure. What am I going to do? But that's our first leading cause of death. When you get a cancer diagnosis, you don't come back and say, oh, doctor told me I had cancer, but that's only the second leading cause of death, so I'm pretty much okay. It doesn't happen that way. And the reason is we forget that heart disease is the #1 cause of death, and we don't actually address the root cause of it. Oftentimes when somebody goes to the doctor, they do some blood work, and what's the #1 blood work they always talk about for heart disease? Cholesterol, exactly. Like cholesterol is the end-all when it comes to heart disease. If lowering cholesterol levels solved the problem, it wouldn't still be our #1 killer. Lowering cholesterol levels has done a lot to sell Lipitor, but it hasn't done a lot to help people with heart disease. And the reason is, if you think of what the cholesterol is really doing and how that's tied in with heart disease, cholesterol is something the body produces itself. Your liver produces cholesterol. So when you take a cholesterol-lowering medication like a statin, what it's actually doing is inhibiting your liver's function or your liver's ability to produce cholesterol. That's why you have to keep coming back for your liver enzyme testing to make sure they're not damaging your liver too much. So the concept behind that is a little strange, but then if you think about the fact that really what's happening with cholesterol is a fat. And if you have a fat that gets oxidized, like if you have a fat at home in an oil, and it gets oxidized, it gets sticky, right? So a sticky fat or sticky cholesterol going through your blood vessels gets attached onto the walls. And when it attaches onto the walls, it kind of, makes your walls, the diameter of your inside of your vessel smaller and smaller as you get more and more attached to the inside. So as the diameter of your blood vessels gets smaller and smaller, and you've got the same blood volume, what happens to your blood pressure? It goes up naturally. I mean, that's physics. So one of the things we do when somebody's blood pressure goes up is we give them a diuretic, so they have less blood volume. Does that make sense? Did that solve the problem? Not at all. But the real reason the cholesterol is sticking to the walls is because it's oxidizing, meaning you don't have enough antioxidants in your system. Antioxidants keep things from oxidizing. It keeps an apple from turning brown, keeps your oil from spoiling in your cupboard. So those antioxidants, if you've got a diet really high in antioxidants, it will allow that cholesterol to just flow through your system and you don't have a problem. So wouldn't it make more sense when we're dealing with heart disease to actually look and say, what's going on with this person's antioxidant level versus where is their cholesterol level, and then doing something to damage the liver to correct that? The other thing from heart disease, we know inflammation is bad for it. So we can check homocysteine levels, C-reactive protein. Those are all really good markers for heart disease, way more than cholesterol. The other thing I just want to touch on with cholesterol is a lot of times people will come in and they'll say, my total cholesterol was high. I don't care if their total cholesterol was high as long as their HDL or their healthy cholesterol was high. Because if their healthy cholesterol is high and the ratios are good, their chances for cardiovascular disease are very, very low. So when a doctor says, oh, my total cholesterol was high, don't panic. Make sure you get your HDL high, and some things you can do that are increase your omega-3s and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But here's our number one killer, heart disease. So then what is our third leading cause of death? I already gave you a huge hint. Death by medical intervention. That is crazy. And it isn't that the doctors are doing anything wrong. It isn't that there's a procedural error. It's just death due to medical intervention. Like, for example, I had a friend of mine who had a cold. And he's in his 30s. He decided to take some cold medicine, didn't think about the fact that he was also on certain other medications. He went to sleep after taking the cold medication and never woke up. We have another friend who's the mother of 2 small children who was having trouble sleeping, so her doctor gave her some sleep medication. She took it for the right dose. The doctor prescribed the correct amount, and however interacted with her body, she also just didn't wake up. So these are just things that can happen when we rely a lot on pharmaceutical medications when there's a lot of natural things we could do that don't have the same potential downfall. So this is our third leading cause of death in the United States. So what is our fastest growing disease in the United States?
I would say obesity.
Well, I guess obesity is a disease, but this is the fastest growing cause of death. I've worded it differently. Alzheimer's disease is growing exponentially. Right now, we've got about 5.5 million people with Alzheimer's living in the United States. But they estimate that by 2050, we will have a new case of about 1 million cases per year. That's not sustainable. And when we look at the research behind what's really causing Alzheimer's, there are certain genetic tests that you can do to see if you have a predisposition for it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But really what's happening is we've got these amyloid plaques that build up. But what the research is showing is we try to do everything to keep those amyloid plaques away. But what their research is showing is that those amyloid plaques are the body's way of trying to protect the brain from an onslaught of other things. So a good explanation for it would be, for example, you create a minefield around, you want to protect yourself from the enemy, so you create a minefield. Well, the minefield's not good. Nobody wants a minefield around them, but it's trying to protect you from something. So those are the way of the body's way, or the brain's way of protecting itself from the onslaught of chemicals and toxins and things like that. So by just trying to remove the minefield still isn't going to solve the problem unless we eliminate the underlying reason for the brain wanting to protect itself from those things. And the more it senses those dangers, the more it wants to create that minefield. So diabetes is the 6th leading cause of death in the United States, and it's increasing dramatically. It increased a full third in 2 years from 2015 to 2017. That's a huge increase. That's clearly a metabolic disease. And the issue that I'm seeing with diabetes is people aren't really being told clearly from their MD what's going on with them. I have way too many people who come in who've had blood work done, and their doctors say, oh, you might be a little bit borderline diabetic, but nothing to worry about. We'll just watch it. And I look at their blood work and I'm like, no, this isn't good. We don't want to just leave it like this. Or people who their doctors say, okay, well, now you're over that 129 threshold with your fasting glucose, so we're going to put you on metformin or glucophage. What they don't tell these people is the metformin or glucophage really isn't solving the problem. The real problem is that the body, every time you have something come into it with glucose in it, your body says, okay, the blood sugar levels are rising. That'll damage fine blood vessels. That's why diabetics have the circulatory problems, the eye problems, the kidney problems, because the fine blood vessels get damaged. And so as the body's trying to protect itself from that excessive glucose in the bloodstream, it kicks out more insulin and tries to force that extra glucose into the cells. Well, the cells need some glucose to get their energy from, but they don't need a lot. So when you try and cram too much glucose into the cells, they just start closing down and become resistant to letting the glucose in. That's why we call type 2 diabetes insulin-resistant diabetes. So when it starts resisting letting it in, from a medical standpoint, we say, okay, we're going to give you glucophage or metformin. And what that acts as, like a hammer to try and cram that insulin into the cells. Well, our cells aren't stupid. So you say, okay, you've got a hammer trying to cram some stuff in. I don't want it. So what do the cells do? They go, oh, we're going to close down just a little tighter. And that's what happens. And then the person goes back to the doctor, 5, 6 months later or a couple of years later, however long it takes. And the doctors go, dang, you just must be eating terrible because your blood sugar levels are coming up. So we're just going to give you another dose. So instead of taking your morning dose, now you're going to take a morning and an evening dose. And that's how they work it until it keeps coming up, and then we add another medication. The problem is if somebody was in their 80s or 90s when they started on that treadmill, life expectancy is what it is. It may not be that bad for somebody. However, when I see people who are type 2 diabetic in their 40s and 50s, they've got a lot of life left to live that way. And instead of really solving the problem and just taking the medication, it's kind of crazy. So what we really work with people is, let's find a way to level out that glucose so that your cells can go, okay, we're not getting flooded with insulin and glucose, so we can start opening up and reversing that. So a lot of people are actually told that once you're on, diabetic medication, you're going to be on it for life. That is not true. If somebody tells you that, do not believe them. Also, if you go to the doctor and you are type 2 diabetic or borderline, and the doctor says, you need to lose weight, you have my permission to slap your doctor. Just reach over and slap them. The reason being because they are telling you to do something physiologically impossible. If every time your blood sugar level rises, your body tries to protect itself from that, so it converts that glucose to fat and stores it. We know that's what it does. I know that, your doctor knows that, that's not a secret. So if you know every time your blood sugar level's hitting up, it's converting it to fat and store it, and you tell this person they need to lose weight, you are asking them to do something physiologically impossible. Without unraveling the body's glucose levels, you will not lose weight. And if you do, it's guaranteed you are going to lose muscle mass. And when people lose muscle mass, we all know what happens. You have so much muscle and so much fat. Typically when you gain fat percentage. And then when you lose both. Then you gain a little bit again, you get a little more fat percentage. Pretty soon you've got a huge gap. And then when you just try and do calorie restriction, you will lose muscle percentage. And then your metabolism continues to fall. So the normal things we do for diet are not working in diabetic situation. This is where you were talking about the obesity. It is an epidemic, absolutely. And if you look at these charts, in 1986, the blue numbers are very low levels of obesity. So 1986, very, very, very low levels of obesity. As we get into 94, we're getting a little bit further. 2002, we're getting more obesity. This is only 2009, and now virtually every state in the union is deep orange to red, every single state. So our levels of obesity are rising, and part of that is also what's going on with our glucose level and what we're eating in our diet. So a lot of times I'll give people a lot of dietary advice. One of the things I talk about is eating organic, all GMO-free, all of that, and I often get, it costs so much money. Oh, I could never afford that. Well, believe me, if you think wellness is expensive, let's try illness. Here is 2013 and 2016 expenditures on healthcare, and I don't really like to call it healthcare because really it's not healthcare, it's really sick care, but we'll go ahead by their terminology. In 2013, we spent $2.9 trillion on healthcare. Now, if you fast forward to 2016, it's $3.3 trillion. So that's an increase of, almost 15%. That means it was over $10,000 per capita. Now, what does per capita mean? Every man, woman, and child in the United States, over $10,000. So if you have a family of 4, can you afford $40,000 for health care? I don't see any hands. I'm shocked, but I don't see any hands. I know I can't either. But somebody has to pay for that. So how is it getting paid for? Well, employers paid about $14,000 per employee for healthcare expenses. Now we know not everybody's employed. We've got retirees, we've got spouses that necessarily don't work, we've got people on disability, we've got children, we've got a lot of people not working. So the difference between that $14,000 per employee and over $10,000 for every man, woman, and child, who's paying that? Nobody. It's going through our taxes. We are the ones paying for that. Here is our growth in national health expenditures as a percentage of our gross domestic product. If you look back at 1965, it was about 6%. About 6% of everything we did in the country was healthcare expenses. So on that chart, it shows 2015 being a little shy of 20%. We're at 23%. 23% of everything we generate in this country is going to healthcare expenses? That's crazy. And if you think about it, our GNP right now is between 2 and 3% a year, somewhere in there. If we're going to have a great year, it'd be 3.2% or something like that. But it's about that. We already know we've spent over 5% more each year in the past few years. So we're going further and further in the hole. So regardless of, for our own health, even if we want our country to survive in some reasonable shape, we've got to start taking control of our health. It's not an option not to. So what can we do? There's a whole new field of science called epigenetics. And what that means is epi meaning above. So above genetics. So we're born with certain genes, and a lot of us, you can get tested for certain genetic things, like people will have a BRCA gene tested for breast cancer. There's a lot of genetic testing we can do. However, genes only make up about 10% of what's going on in our body. 90% we have total control over. So the way I like to describe that is it's genes that load the gun. But it's our lifestyle that picks up the gun and pulls the trigger. What that means is you can have a loaded gun, and some people's gun are loaded a little more weighted than others. Some people may have 1 bullet in the chamber. Some people may have 5 or 6. But you have a loaded gun. If you don't touch it and you live your life in such a way to not kick that off and trigger it, you won't have a problem. It's what we do with our lifestyle that actually pulls the trigger, and that we have control over. And you can measure the genetic component, but it's only 10%. Like MTHFR is a great thing to measure, and some of these genetic tests are really easy. And just so that you guys know, on the bottom here, I've got a phone number. It's actually a text number. If you text your first name, your email address, and the word notes, every single one of the slides will get emailed to you. So you don't have to worry about taking a zillion notes, because that's my biggest pet peeve when I'm at a lecture. I'm like, she went through the screen so fast, and she had all this stuff on there, and I couldn't take it. So no, just it's 714-980-4480, and just put in your first name, your email address, and the word notes, and all the slides will go to you. So anyway, the MTHFR makes good sense to check, especially if you're pregnant. You want to make sure you're absorbing your folic acid so you don't have neural tube defects. It tells you what types of folic acid or folate work for you, things like that. You can check and see if your vitamin D receptors are working. You can also check your risk of Alzheimer's with APOE4. If you're concerned about Alzheimer's, that's a great one to check. Check the ones you think are necessary. If you're concerned about breast cancer, go ahead and check your BRCA1 or 2. However, a lot of times I've had women actually come into my office who were positive and had their breasts removed. Now, in my opinion, exactly, I'm not judging, but I don't think that they were very well informed, because just because you remove an organ doesn't mean you're not going to get cancer. It just means it's going to go someplace else. So removing organs just as a preventative measure doesn't make sense to me. Also, one of the measurements you can do is your telomere length. Your telomere length, on the end of each little chromosome, there's like a little cap, almost like a shoelace end cap. When you're chronologically, biologically young, you've got a nice, big, long end cap. When you're getting older and you're burning your genes up, so to speak, you've got a very little short end cap. So you can measure that. But that's the beauty of it, is you can measure it, and then you can do some things to increase your longevity and increase your health, and then you can remeasure it again. So most of what I'm recommending doing the measuring at is to kind of create a baseline, so if you know what you're doing is helping you or not. So, but that's only the loaded gun. We have...
How much is really genetic as opposed to My mother teaching me how to cook like this, and I'm teaching my kids how to cook like this.
I'm going to go ahead and go into that a little bit, but if you kind of hold your questions till at the end so I make sure I get through all the screens, okay? We have about 90% control over our health. So however your mom taught you to cook could contribute to that 90%, but the 10% that's genetic, your mom's training you isn't going to affect. But 90% you have control over. The problem is, once that trigger's pulled, now your control is damage control. Now you're not really in the front driver's seat, now you're playing damage control. Once you've pulled the trigger, it's damage control. So what we want to do is minimize as much damage control as we can and help people just as a whole eat better. So the number one key would be to eat real food. So when I talk about real food, a lot of times my patients don't get when I'm talking about real food. I've actually given people long discussions about it and then had them come back the next week and I go, so what did you have to eat? Well, I had Lunchables today. And I'm like, Lunchables? In one lifetime is Lunchables a meal? What are you doing? It's like mind-boggling to me. So real food means you can look at it and say, this is an apple. You don't have to read through a whole long list of ingredients. If it's already ground up nuts, you could look at the label and it might say almonds. That's pretty much all it should say. You shouldn't have a whole long length, then that's not real food. Real food is living. Real food will spoil if you don't eat it. If you have a Twinkie, for example, it's not going to spoil. That's not real food. So when I'm talking real food, it provides real energy. You know what it is. It will spoil. I actually purchased some tomatoes. My stepmother actually purchased some tomatoes, and they left. They left the tomatoes there. And I didn't get around to eating them. And they were sitting on the ledge of my sink. I'm like, 3 weeks, those tomatoes still sitting there. No mold, no rot, no nothing. Clearly, there's something wrong with those tomatoes. So when I say real food, it might even look like a tomato, but some things that even look like real food really aren't. So some of you may already be aware of this study, but for those of you that aren't, how many of you have heard of Pottinger's cats? Okay, a few of you. Dr. Pottinger, this was in the 1950s. He did a study, and he did a study on cats. And what he did was he split up the group of cats. He fed some of them a nice raw cat food diet, and the other ones a processed cat food diet. And he started noticing that in the processed cat food diet, he was seeing their teeth were becoming kind of mangled. They were developing certain problems. And as each generation of cats went a little bit further, he noticed more and more problems. Birth defects, infertility, all problems we're experiencing now. How many people do you know that have braces or had braces recently? A lot. Whereas my father's generation, nobody had braces. It wasn't necessary. Everybody's teeth had nice, big, fine teeth. What's happening? Exactly what he saw in the cats. We're seeing birth defects. We're seeing fertility problems. When I got married in 1980, there was almost no such thing as a fertility clinic. If you didn't have children, it was just because you weren't trying. Now, fertility is huge. There's 100 times the fertility clinics that there were even 20 years ago. So fertility problems are growing. So we can already see the same problems in the human species that he saw in the cats. But here's the scary part. After 3 generations, he said, okay, we're going to switch these cats and see what happens. It took 5 generations. 5 generations to reverse the problems. So if right now everybody in the country started eating a real food diet, which isn't easy to do, I will acknowledge that. If everyone in the country started eating a raw food diet, it would take 5 generations to undo what we've done in 3 generations. It is scary. So here just talks a little bit about, just to kind of back up, what we eat affects us. This talks about unrefined plant food consumption versus heart disease and cancer. Now, if you notice, the green is calories from unrefined plant food. If you go to Thailand, Korea, Laos, very high plant food diet consumption, very low deaths from heart disease and cancer. You move over to the other end for Hungary in the United States, very low percentage of our food consumption is from unrefined plant foods, and very high percentage of death from our two largest causes of death, cancer and heart disease. So it's almost a perfect graph. I mean, if you're going to try and write it, you couldn't make it any more perfect. So a lot of people say, well, it's okay. I take my vitamins. I'm covered. I have my Centrum Silver. Or my Woman's Wem a day. I'm covered. The problem is that is not real nutrition. Those vitamins are synthetic. Your body doesn't know what to do with that any more than it does some of the chemicals in your food. If you are taking synthetically derived vitamins, it is not only a waste, but it can actually be harmful. And to show that, for example, a lot of times you'll see studies of what was considered good and then what was considered bad. Like vitamin E, for example. Years ago, vitamin E is great for heart disease. Now recently, vitamin E is terrible for heart disease. If you actually look at the studies, here's the difference. The first study got its vitamin E from wheat germ oil. You get your vitamins from wheat germ oil, it has one effect. Second study, synthetically produced vitamin E. You get your vitamin E from another source, from a synthetic source, it's going to have a different effect on your body. So just taking vitamins that are not derived from foods is not helpful. Hence, when you go to your doctor and they say, you need some vitamin D, I'm going to write you a prescription for 50,000 IUs of vitamin D, and that should just solve your problem. It might increase your D, but it's not going to solve your problem because that D is not one you're going to assimilate the same. The same with iron. I can't tell you how many women, they have anemia or they're pregnant, and they said, okay, well, you need some iron supplements. And they claim, it makes me so constipated. Well, yes, because you're not actually absorbing it. Let's get you some forms of iron that you can actually absorb. So what you take into your body has to be absorbable. So the second key, first key was eat real food. Second key, get to the root of the problem. And I talked a little bit about that. Don't just say, I have high blood pressure, so I'm going to take my proton or my diuretic or my medication for that or my medication for my diabetes, because you're not really resolving the root of the problem. Most times you're just masking the symptom. And what I call that is painting the leaves green. In other words, if you have a plant at home and you see its leaves are turning yellow, if you go in there with a can of spray paint and go, look at it, it's so much better now. That's what you're doing when you go in and your blood work looks off and your doctor says, well, take this. That'll change your blood work. Oh, yep, now your blood works just fine. Well, no, the plant still didn't get any light or water or whatever it was it needed. You're still not getting that either. But now your lab work looks very good, so everybody's happy. That's the problem. So how much damage do we have to control? We can check that. We can do damage control testing. These are tests that we can run to see what types of damages we have. For example, we can check a complete gluten profile. Do you really have a gluten allergy? And again, if you want, just text that to that. That way you don't have to take a whole bunch of pictures. And because I know the print on there is super, super small. A lot of times when people come in and they want to, they say, I was already tested, I don't have celiac disease. Well, that doesn't mean you don't have a gluten allergy, because there's only 2 of those that they're going to check for celiac disease. You could have any one of the other ones, so you want to check all of them. And a lot of times there are cross-reactants, things that your body views as very similar to gluten. So when you go on a gluten-free diet and you're eating more corn and oats and quinoa and all the other things that we eat when we're on a gluten-free diet, you can have a reaction to those too. But you won't know it, and you'll be like, shoot, I tried that gluten-free diet, and I didn't feel any better. So clearly I don't have a gluten sensitivity. No, you might have a gluten sensitivity, but you might also have another sensitivity. You can also check specifically for intestinal permeability. It's a very easy test. So you'll know, is my gut permeable? Do I have leaky gut? Is that what I really need to fix to begin with? You can also check specific blood serum markers. Vitamin D's one I always check. And a lot of times the lab minimum is 30. So if your doctor says you're low, in my mind, you are like rock bottom, like almost non-existent, because I like to have a 50 minimum, especially if somebody has an autoimmune issue, because in autoimmune issue, you need those regulatory T cells to be upregulated to control your immune system, and vitamin D will do that. Also, a lot of times I'll measure LDH. Most doctors do not, conventional doctors do not check LDH now. Years ago, everybody did, but somehow it fell off the favorability chart, and we don't do it anymore. And that doesn't mean LDL, which is what is checked. A lot of times if you go in and you say, I want LDH, they'll say, I think they meant LDL. No, that's not what you mean. You really want LDL. You can measure your C-reactive protein to see what's going on with your inflammation. I also recommend checking your hormone levels. And when I say hormone levels, I don't mean just a couple of them. I really want, for women and men for that matter, E1, E2, and E3. That means your estrone, estradiol, and estriol. And when you look at them, because estrogen is so proliferative, meaning it causes cellular growth, it's very cancer-causing, both from a breast cancer standpoint, ovarian cancer, things like that, but also men, prostate cancer. We see a ton of men with high estrogen levels because what's happening is they are aromatizing, or they are converting their testosterone into estrogen. Men, you do not want a lot of estrogen. You want all your testosterone. Do not let it convert. So if you get checked and your testosterone's a little low and your estrogens are high, that doesn't make you fun anymore. So we want to make sure our estrogen and progesterone levels are good. FSH, LH, find out what's actually going on. If you're in a menstrual cycle, you're not in after menopause, do some saliva testing for your hormones. The reason I like that is because you put a little saliva in a vial. Throughout the course of the month, you do it with 11 vials, so you get a report, and it says, here's what my estrogen levels were doing, here's what my progesterone levels were doing, here's when I had my luteal surge, here's what was going on, I was or wasn't ovulating. You can actually see it, versus if you just have blood work done, wonderful, here's what it was on this day, but how do you know what happened the rest of the month? So saliva testing for hormones and adrenals is super important. Because if you're measuring your cortisol levels, that's that stress hormone. If you do it morning, noon, midday, and night, it'll tell you where your cortisol levels are. Are you actually having your cortisol handled well, so you're sleeping fine? That is involved with your stress, your sleep cycles, all kinds of things. Check your DHEA levels, those types of things. You can also, if you're having problems, foods aren't the problem, maybe you're having a chemical sensitivity. So you can check and say, am I actually having a problem with BPA, aflatoxins, mercury? You can actually check these things. And if you do them through somebody who does them as a whole panel, it's not outrageously expensive. If you go to your MD and try to have these run each individually, it's going to be thousands of dollars, and your insurance is probably going to kick it out because they're going to go, why did you have to have all that tested? That doesn't even make sense. Whereas there's a good reason sometimes to test it. Autoimmune reactivity screen. A lot of times I will have this run. This tells you what you've got a reaction to. And I'll tell you one of the reasons I like to have this run. I'll just tell you about one of my patients. This gal comes in her early 20s. She's a dancer. And she says, something is really wrong. I'm forgetting my dance steps. I'm clumsy. I don't know what's wrong, but something is really wrong. And so we did the food allergy testing, and she's really allergic to a lot of foods, of which corn was one of them. Corn's super hard to avoid. She also had gluten, so corn and gluten and sesame and a couple other things. So we went, let's check and see what physical body part you actually have an antibody to. So when you eat these foods, what is it damaging? What body part or body system is being damaged? In her case, it was the myelin basic protein. So that means if this 20-year-old girl keeps eating corn and gluten and sesame, she's almost guaranteed to have MS later on. But conventionally, nobody's going to check her for MS until she's so far progressed that it's like, that's probably what it is. And then, yep, that's what you've got, and you've had it for 30 years, and so sorry. But in her case, knowing, believe me, she is adhering to her diet. Sometimes when you know what your potential downfall is, you know what has the gun loaded, you're a little more rigorous on actually following through. I know that personally with myself. I do this for a living, so I'm like, okay, I'm just going to I'm going to run my own things. Well, yeah, I had a gluten allergy, and I thought, well, I don't really have a lot of gluten symptoms. I mean, I feel bloated and stuff, but it's not life-threatening. Well, no, because I also found out some of my own brain tissue had an antibody too. You better believe I want my brain intact for a long, long, long time. I won't touch gluten. You'd have to force feed it to me. So knowing what antibody you have or what your potential, after you pull the trigger, what your potential getting shot with, can make all the difference in the world. And if you're a practitioner, it can make a difference to your patients too. This one I put up there specifically for an autoimmune issue because so many people have thyroid issues and so few people realize that it's an autoimmune disease. Because most doctors, if you go to a conventional doctor, they're like, yep, your thyroid levels are off. Mostly they're just going to check your TSH. That's off, so we'll give you some Synthroid or some levothyroxine. And you'll just be on that for the rest of your life and everything's fine. What they don't tell them is we could check the antibodies and we could find out if it's actually an autoimmune disease. If it is, chances are you may have another autoimmune disease, so if we can figure out how to rectify that one, it can actually help prevent further other damage down the road, but it can also keep from damaging the tissue. If you can find out, do I have chemical sensitivities? Do I have food sensitivities? You check those things and you can prevent the progression of an autoimmune disease. Now, autoimmune disease is the fourth leading cause of disability in women in the United States. It's huge. So if we can prevent autoimmune issues, that's huge. Also, you can do some detective work. You can do a PET scan on your brain. If you check and you have the APA04 gene marker for Alzheimer's and you are concerned because you're not remembering things as clearly as you used to, go have a PET scan and find out what's really going on, because those amyloid plaques will light up in a PET scan. Then you have a baseline. So if later you're having more and more problems, you'll know what's going on. PET scans specifically help check for areas of abnormal glucose metabolism. So when they check for cancer and they're checking for abnormal glucose metabolism, that's a clue on what's causing the cancer. If the PET scan lights up, the cancer lights up because it's absorbing the glucose real readily. So my third key is control your glucose metabolism. If you can control your glucose metabolism, all those diseases we mentioned were actually metabolic diseases. You can do so much to control those. And here's why it's such a huge thing. In healthy cells, they can burn glucose. They can also, after they've used up all the glucose, they can burn glycogen stores. After they've used all of that up, then they can actually burn ketones and fatty acids. Cancer cells, on the other hand, do not have the ability to burn glycogen or ketones. They only have the ability to burn glucose. So if you keep your glucose out of your system for extended periods of time, you're going to weaken cancer cells. So the cure for disease is to burn ketones, not glucose. Whether your disease is heart disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, obesity, cancer, autoimmune disease, or you just want to save money, the key is to burn ketones. Now, one way to do that is to have more of a ketogenic diet. Super easy. The do's are have 70 to 75% of healthy fats, 20 to 25% of healthy proteins, and 5 to 10% of healthy net carbs. A little higher into the vegetable than the fruits. Don'ts, no unhealthy fats. That means no unpasteurized dairy, no canola, hydrogenated oils. Do not eat non-organic or corn-fed animal proteins, and avoid artificial sweeteners. You can measure for ketones several ways. Urine is not the best because once you get in ketosis, it's not valid anymore. Blood is very accurate but also painful because you have to prick your finger. Breath is the easiest and the most accurate, and you just blow in it and it measures your acetones. If you're interested and you have patients or somebody at home that really wants to measure your ketones, just call my office or send it on that little text, and we can send you that information. But the key is when you're doing a ketogenic diet, you want to do intermittent fasting with it. And here's why. There was a study where mice were fed a high-fat diet, 60% from high fat, but they fasted for 16 hours daily. The fasting mice weighed 28% less than the others. And this is on a high-fat diet. But the big thing is they also experienced no increase in cholesterol. Because one of the things doctors always fight is, you do a ketogenic diet with all those high fats, your cholesterol is going to come up. If you're doing intermittent fasting with it, it won't happen. Here's the picture of these, the mice, their liver fat. The mouse allowed to eat every 24 hours, a lot of fat in that liver. The ones that were restricted to an 8-hour feeding window, very little fat. So it's combining the intermittent fasting with the ketogenic diet. And that means eating within an 6 to 8 hour period. That means all your food, I don't care how much you eat, how many times you eat, but only within a 6 to 8 hour period, so that your fasting time, you can have water, maybe some teas, but nothing else. That's the definition of fasting. So the steps for success: A, get over your fear of fat. People are very, very, very afraid of fat. It's not that bad. Severely limit your grains. Keep your net carbs to 20 to 30 to start. Fast 16 to 18 hours a day and drink plenty of water. You can also monitor for your ketones. The food you're going to eat is going to have to be nutritionally dense food, to get plenty of sleep and movement. An example of a protocol that we use specifically for people who have cancer is we'll put them on a water and juice fast for 48 hours prior to their treatment. We'll add some organic juice recipes the day of treatment, and then we'll continue with organic juice 24 hours after treatment. And then in between their treatments, we'll keep them on an intermittent fast of 18 hours. And then we'll monitor their vitamin D levels and their LDH. We also have specific protocols that we use for cancer prevention, for pre-treatment, during chemo, during radiation, and they're all customized for what that person's protocol is. The recovery, maintenance, and then also autoimmune diseases and metabolic type issues. A lot of people will ask me about the difference between juicing and smoothies or blending. Why I recommend juicing specifically for this is I want them getting a ton of good quality nutrition, really in-depth nutrition. In general, when somebody's doing smoothies or blending, they are getting the fiber with it so their body doesn't get as much of a hit from the sugars. So there are pros and cons to both. I just recommend the juicing when we're specifically working on cancer protocols. And then these are some good examples of some recipes that we have for ketogenic type healthy recipes. So again, if you text that number with your first name, your email address, and the word notes, it will send all of these slides to you, and there's some additional things that will come with it. So the doctor of the future will give no medicine, but will interest their patients in the care of the human frame, in diet, and the cause and prevention of disease. Thomas Edison. He was very thought-provoking. And that's really where I think we're going with our medicine. So again, it's only 10% are genes. That is the loaded gun. You don't have to have a problem as long as you don't pick up the gun and shoot it. Once you pick up the gun and shoot it, you are doing damage control. But you still have 90% control over your health, even if you're doing damage control. So we have control over our own health. And this is a Chinese saying, when diet is wrong, medicine is of no use. When diet is correct, medicine is of no need. So prevention, we all know, is a lot easier and a lot less expensive than the cure. So in that way, let food be thy medicine and medicine thy food. By Hippocrates, who wants to argue with him? Thank you.